He came home to find his wife's wedding ring sitting in the center of the divorce papers, and a note that said, "I stopped waiting for you the day I buried our daughter alone." That one sentence. That is what 6 years of marriage had been reduced to. And the worst part? He hadn't even known there was a daughter to bury. If you're new here, before the story takes you somewhere you're not ready for, please subscribe, like, and share this video right now. This channel exists because of people like you who believe stories like this deserve to be heard. One tap. That's all. Now let's go back to that penthouse, because what happened in the next 30 days will remind you exactly why love is the most dangerous thing a human being can choose. The rain had been falling on Paris for 3 days straight. Thierry Marchand noticed it the way he had been noticing everything lately. Distantly, through glass, as though the world were a film he was watching from a seat slightly too far back. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse on the Isle St. Louis, tie loosened, a glass of scotch warming in his hand, and watched the Seine absorb the rain without complaint. The river didn't resist what fell into it. He had always envied that about water. Behind him, he heard her. Not her voice, just her presence. The particular shift in atmosphere that Maëlle had always created when she entered a room. The way the air rearranged itself around her without apology. 6 years of marriage had made him fluent in her silences. He knew the difference between the silence of a woman thinking and the silence of a woman who has already decided. This was the second kind. He turned. She was standing at the marble dining table in a gray dress, her hair pulled back with the kind of careless precision that took effort to achieve. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the papers in front of her, thick, white, devastating in their cleanliness. The way a person looks at something they have stared at so many times it has stopped feeling real. Then she looked up, and that was when Thierry understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives too late, that the distance between them was no longer a wound that might heal on its own. It had been allowed to calcify. It had become architecture. "I had these drawn up 2 weeks ago," she said. No preamble. No softening. "I've been sitting with them, trying to find a reason not to put them on this table." A breath. One single, controlled breath. "I couldn't find one." He set his glass down. "Maëlle, I'm not finished. Not sharp. Not angry. Worse than both, resolved. I have watched you disappear from this marriage incrementally for 18 months. I have cooked dinners you didn't come home for. I have slept in a bed that felt like a hotel room. I have smiled at your colleagues at events and played the role of Thierry Marchand's wife with everything I had." Her voice dropped. "And I have done all of that alone. All of it. Every single piece of it. Alone." The word landed in the room like something thrown. Thierry stood very still. There was a version of himself, the version that ran a billion-euro development firm, the version that had sat across negotiating tables from men who used silence as a weapon, that knew how to hold a room. That version was nowhere. What remained was just a man in an empty penthouse watching his marriage take its last breath. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. And it wasn't deflection. It was genuine. He had lost the language. "I don't want you to say anything." She pushed the papers slightly toward him without touching them. "I'm giving you 30 days. 30 days to show me. Not tell me, show me. That there is something left in you that still knows how to love me. If there is, we try. If there isn't..." She picked up her pen and set it beside the papers with the finality of a judge setting down a gavel. "We stop pretending." The silence that followed was enormous. "And if I believe it's already too late," he said. The honesty of it cost him. He saw her flinch, just barely, just a millimeter of movement in her jaw. But he saw it. "Then it probably is," she said. "Good night." She walked toward the east wing. He didn't follow. He should have followed. He stood alone in the dark for a long time, the divorce papers white and terrible on the table, the rain insisting against the glass, and his eyes moved, inevitably, the way eyes always move toward the things we cannot stop ourselves from seeing, to the corridor, to the door at the end of it, the closed door. The one neither of them spoke about, never entered. The one Maëlle had paused in front of tonight for just a moment before her hand pulled back from the handle like the wood itself was hot. The nursery. Thierry looked away. He didn't sleep. The first thing he did the next morning was cancel 2 board meetings. His assistant called back within 4 minutes. He declined to explain. He stood in the kitchen at 6 in the morning and made breakfast, real breakfast, not the performative kind, but the kind that required him to stand at a stove and remember things. Eggs the way she liked them, slightly underdone, never hard. Toast from the sourdough she bought from the boulangerie 2 streets over. Coffee with cardamom and enough cream to turn it the color of sand. A detail she had mentioned exactly once, 3 years ago in passing while reading a Sunday paper. He had filed it away without knowing why. He set everything on the table by the window and waited. At 7:45, Maëlle appeared. Silk robe, hair loose, the particular careful blankness on her face that he recognized as her armor, the expression she wore when she was protecting herself from hope. She stopped when she saw the table. He watched her see the coffee first, the exact color of it, and watched something move across her face before she could catch it and put it away. Something that looked uncomfortably like grief, like the memory of a husband who used to know her. She sat without a word. She picked up the cup. She took 1 sip and for 2 full seconds she closed her eyes. He said nothing. He was relearning the very first rule of Maëlle. That silence, given freely, was worth more to her than any number of words. They ate. It was not comfortable. It was not warm. But it was shared, and sharing was more than they had managed in months. And he held on to that the way a man holds onto a ledge with his fingertips. That afternoon he left white ranunculus on her desk. Not roses. He remembered. He had always remembered, even during the months he'd been failing her. The information had stayed intact somewhere behind the wall he'd built, that she found roses impersonal. Roses are what men buy when they don't know the woman, she told him once, half laughing, at a dinner party, where someone else's husband had sent roses. He'd laughed with her and remembered it for 5 years. She walked past the flowers twice. On the 3rd pass she stopped. She leaned down, pressed her face into them, and breathed. He turned away before she looked up. Some moments are not meant to be witnessed. But that evening, when he came into the living room, she had placed a single stem of ranunculus in a narrow glass on the coffee table where he would see it. He sat down across from it and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been locked in a specific position for a very long time, moving just slightly, the way ice moves in early spring when the temperature is still too cold to call it thawing. He was careful not to let himself feel too much. He did not yet know that the worst was still coming. It was the architect who changed everything. Thierry had arranged for the renovation consultation impulsively, in the first days of the 30, because grand gestures were the language he defaulted to when he was frightened. A full redesign of the penthouse, new light, new space, whatever she wanted, the whole thing rebuilt around her preferences. He'd presented the idea expecting at best a muted acknowledgement. Maëlle had looked at him for a long moment and said, "All right." Not enthusiasm, not gratitude, just a door, left slightly open. Sebastian Allard arrived on a Thursday. 38, dark-eyed, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a life spent being found interesting by beautiful women. He walked through the apartment with a measuring tape and an expression of genuine attention, and he directed all of it at Maëlle. Thierry watched from across the room, phone in hand, pretending to read emails. He watched Sebastian ask Maëlle how she moved through the space in the mornings. Where do you stand when the light comes in? Where do you go first? And he watched Maëlle answer with a kind of animated detail she hadn't offered Thierry in months. He watched Sebastian lean against the kitchen counter with his arms folded, head tilted, genuinely, visibly delighted by her. He watched Maëlle laugh. A real laugh. Unguarded. The laugh he used to cause. Thierry set his phone on the table with a quietness that took physical effort to maintain. He crossed the room. Not fast. Measured. He came to stand at Maëlle's side, naturally, as though joining a conversation he'd been part of all along, and placed his hand lightly at the small of her back. Just his palm. Just there. Maëlle went very still for exactly 1 second. Then she continued her sentence. But she didn't move away from his hand. Sebastian glanced at Thierry with the particular micro-assessment of a man recalibrating, and said something professionally charming, and moved on to the next room. Thierry's hand stayed where it was a moment longer than necessary. When Sebastian left, Maëlle turned to look at him. "That was unnecessary," she said. "I know." he said. Something moved in her eyes. Not quite amusement. Something more complicated and more useful. That night was the first night she came to bed without retreating to the east wing. She lay on her side, facing away from him. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The gap between them was approximately 10 inches and contained the entire weight of their marriage. He could hear her breathing, could tell from the pattern of it that she wasn't sleeping, which meant she could tell the same about him. Neither of them acknowledged this. But at some point in the dark, without ceremony or preamble, she shifted. Just slightly, her shoulder blade pressing, barely, against his arm. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He lay there in the dark with the warmth of her against his arm and stared at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something that wasn't numbness. Terrified him completely. It was Maëlle who had decided, quietly, somewhere in the second week, that she was done disappearing. She had not named it as reclamation. That was too deliberate a word for what it was. It was more instinctive than that. It was the particular animal intelligence of a woman who has spent too long making herself small and finally felt the wrongness of it in her bones. She stood in her dressing room on a Tuesday evening and pulled the crimson dress from the back of the wardrobe where it had hung, unworn, for 18 months. She had bought it for a gala they were supposed to attend together and hadn't, because Thierry had been in Frankfurt and she had worn something sensible and smiled at people and come home alone and hung the crimson dress back in the dark. She put it on. Cut on the bias, silk, the color of something that refuses to be ignored. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Not with vanity, but with something more complicated. Recognition. There you are, she thought. I was wondering where you went. She walked into the living room. Thierry was on the phone. Mid-sentence. Something about an acquisition, something about a timeline, the particular low register of a man conducting business with one part of his brain while the other part stopped. She watched it happen in real time. The sentence stopped. Not fumbled. Stopped the way a record stops when someone lifts the needle. His eyes found her and stayed. The silence on his end of the call stretched for 3 full seconds. Thierry. Tiny voice from the phone. He blinked. My apologies. Continue. He turned away. But in the next 4 minutes, his eyes came back to her 3 times, and each time it took him a moment longer to pull them away, and Maëlle poured herself a glass of wine and allowed herself the small, private victory of knowing that whatever distance he had created, she had not become invisible inside it. Remember me, she thought, looking at him. You are going to remember every single thing you almost let go. The dance was an accident. Or it appeared to be. Later, she would not be entirely sure. She had put music on a Friday evening. French jazz, old and unhurried. The kind that moves at the speed of a conversation you don't want to end. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which had become a form of luxury. She was clearing glasses from the coffee table and humming without realizing it. She felt him before she heard him. The warmth of him. Close. The particular gravity that Thierry had always had in a room. A physical fact like temperature. She turned. He was standing 2 feet away with his hand held out. Open palm. No certainty in his face. Only the question, only the asking, which moved her more than confidence ever had. She took his hand. He drew her in slowly. Space between them at first. His hand settled at her waist, hers at his shoulder, and they moved into the music like 2 people who had done this before, who had done this 100 times, who had been good at exactly this even when they were bad at everything else. The song moved around them. His thumb traced one slow arc against her waist, and she felt it from her spine to her fingertips. He said nothing. She said nothing. The music carried it. Halfway through the second song, he pulled her slightly closer. Not dramatically, an inch. The remaining inch between them. His jaw against her temple. Her hand moving from his shoulder to the back of his neck without her consciously deciding to put it there. She could feel his heartbeat. It was not calm. The song ended. Neither of them moved immediately. 3 seconds. 4. The space between the end of the music and the return of the world. In that pause, Maëlle felt something she had been steeling herself against. The terrifying, unwanted, absolutely inconvenient truth that she still knew this man. That her body had not forgotten him. That love, it turned out, did not have the decency to expire just because you needed it to. She stepped back. His hand stayed at her waist a half-second longer, then released. "Good night," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Good night," he said. She walked to the east wing. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her face and breathed. She was in serious trouble. If you're watching this and you've ever stood in a hallway outside a room you couldn't bring yourself to enter, if you've ever loved someone and lost something and carried it in silence because the alternative was falling apart, then you already know what's behind that nursery door. Subscribe right now and stay with us, because the next part of the story is the part that changes everything. For both of them, and for you. She found him in the nursery at 2 in the morning. She had woken to his absence, had become, over these 3 weeks, acutely calibrated to the specific weight of him in the bed, the way you recalibrate to something you thought you'd lost, and had seen the line of light under the door at the end of the corridor. She pushed it open. The room was small and white and had never been anything but potential. A crib they had assembled together on a rainy Sunday 3 years ago. A mobile with paper stars. A bookshelf with 3 books on it. She had bought them gradually over months, letting herself believe. The room still smelled faintly of the paint they had chosen together from 40 sample swatches, laughing because they couldn't agree on white, of all things, as if white could have 40 versions. It had 40 versions. That was what she remembered. Terry was on the floor, back against the crib, knees drawn up, dress shirt still on from the day, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he looked. Devastated was the only word. Not grieving. Destroyed. Like a man who had finally stopped running from something and turned to find it larger than he'd estimated. He didn't startle when she entered. He looked up at her with the eyes of a man who has been waiting, without knowing it, to be found. "You should go back to sleep," he said. His voice was wrong, rough in a way she had never heard. "Tell me," she said. He looked away, pressed the back of his head against the crib slats. His jaw worked. "Terry." She said his name like a hand extended. Take it. Tell me." Something broke open in his face. "I was in Singapore," he said. "You called me at 11:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just sat down for a meeting and my phone buzzed and I saw your name and I stepped out. A breath, ragged at the edges. You told me." His voice fractured on the next word and he let it, which was the most frightening thing she had ever seen him do. "And Maëlle, I stood in a glass corridor in Singapore and I couldn't. He pressed his fist to his mouth, hard. His eyes were wet and he was not bothering to hide it. "I could not breathe. I could not think. I hung up and I sat in a chair and I had no idea what to do with what I was feeling because I had never felt it before. That specific grief. Like something that was supposed to exist simply didn't, like a future that was there and then wasn't and the world just continued, as though nothing had been taken." Maëlle stood in the doorway. She was very cold. "I called you back," she whispered. 4 times. "I know." The words came out like something that had been lodged in him for a year and a half. "I know you did. I couldn't answer. He stopped. Started again. Started from somewhere deeper. "I didn't come home because I didn't know how to come home and be useless. I have always been the person who fixes things. I fix things. I solve things. I build them back. And there was nothing to build. There was nothing to fix. There was nothing I could do that would change what had happened. And His voice broke fully, completely, without recovery. "I couldn't face you with nothing in my hands. So I stayed away. And then a day passed and I hadn't come. And then a week. And then coming back felt impossible because I had already failed you so completely that walking through the door felt like an insult." The silence was shattering. Maëlle's hands were shaking. She pressed them together. "I labored for 11 hours, she said. And her voice was something she had never heard from herself before. Stripped of everything. Just the truth, raw and structural, like a building with its walls removed. 11 hours, Terry. Your mother came. Mine came. The nurses were kind. Her breath caught and released. I held her. She was so small. She was so..." She stopped, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. breathed through it. And you were not there. You were not there. And I told myself you didn't come because you didn't care enough. Because it was easier than the truth. What's the truth? He asked, barely audible. That you were as broken as I was. She made a sound that was not quite a sob. And we broke separately, in different countries, alone. Her voice fractured. We should have broken together. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He crossed the room in 3 steps and he put his arms around her. Not gently, not tentatively, but the way a person holds something they have been terrified of losing, with their full strength, with their whole body, pressing her head against his chest and his face into her hair, and she felt him shaking. Thierry Marchand, shaking. She grabbed fistfuls of his shirt. They stood in the center of the nursery and fell apart together, which was the only way either of them had ever needed to do it, and had not, until now, been permitted to. When the worst of it passed, when the shaking settled and the breathing slowly returned to something functional, he pulled back just enough to look at her face. His hands framed it. His thumbs moved over her cheekbones, clearing what was there, gentle in a way that dismantled something she'd been fortifying for a year. I have to tell you something, she said. He waited. I named her. A breath. The admission of it, the private, sacred, 18-month-old secret of it, arriving in the open air of this room for the very first time. While I was alone. While I was still holding her. I named her Elise. Thierry closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were devastated and grateful simultaneously. The way eyes look when someone gives you something that also breaks you. Elise, he repeated, the name in his voice. She had not known how much she needed to hear that, to hear him say it, to have the name exist between them rather than locked inside her alone. She kissed him. She hadn't planned it. It arrived the way necessary things do, without announcement. His sharp inhale, then his arms tightening, one hand at the back of her neck, and he kissed her back with the kind of care that costs something, slow and deliberate and achingly careful, as though she were a wound he was trying not to worsen, as though he understood, finally, the exact weight of what he was being trusted with. She felt tears on her face. She wasn't sure whose. When they separated, she pressed her forehead to his and they breathed the same air in the room where Elise had almost been, and it was the most painful and the most tender thing she had ever felt simultaneously. And she thought, this is what we should have done 18 months ago. This exact thing. In this exact room. Better late, she thought, than never carrying it together at all. They did not speak about what had shifted that night. Simply had. Small things changed. He reached past her for something in the kitchen and let his hand rest on her shoulder briefly on the way back. And she didn't stiffen. She fell asleep reading on the sofa and woke to find a blanket over her. His navy blanket from the bedroom, and him in the chair across from her, working quietly, having apparently decided that proximity was acceptable now. She wore white on a Sunday. Simple linen. Hair loose. Bare feet. He walked in, stopped, looked at her and said nothing for 4 seconds. Just looked, with that expression she had almost catalogued as permanently gone. Uncomplicated wonder. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to still be permitted to see. You're staring, she said. I'm aware, he said. She handed him his coffee. Their fingers met. His eyes dropped to it, came back up. Something between them, the particular rebuilding electricity of two people reclaiming their own language. She allowed herself privately to feel hope. Just a little. Just enough. But hope, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing. Because it had so far to fall. The call came on a Wednesday. Thierry took it in his office, door closed. Maëlle was reading in the living room and paid it no attention until she registered the duration, 40 minutes, then 50, and then the particular quality of the silence when it ended. She looked up. He was standing in the office doorway. Something was wrong with his face. What happened? She said. He came and sat down across from her. Leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands together, the posture of a man deciding how honest to be. She recognized it. She had been cataloging his postures for 6 years. There's a situation, he said. In Geneva. Financial irregularities in the development fund. I've been trying to contain it for months. I have a board emergency I can't defer. He met her eyes. I would need to leave Thursday, potentially for a week. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of before. Different. This quiet had teeth. Maëlle looked at him carefully. How long have you known about this situation? A pause. Very brief. But she caught it. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. The 30 days had already been underway for 3 weeks when he'd known about a potential Geneva trip and had not mentioned it and had continued breakfast and flowers and dancing and had said nothing. She stood up. Maëlle. I am not angry, she said, which was the most frightening possible thing she could have said. And they both knew it. I am noting it. Because the last time there was a situation in another city and you didn't come home, I was alone in a white room, and I think you should understand that I notice this pattern even when you don't. She picked up her book. Her hands were entirely steady. I'm going to bed. He didn't sleep that night. In the morning she was at the kitchen table with her coffee and a phone call of her own. She was laughing, warm, easy, and she said, yes, this week actually works perfectly, and I'd love to. It's been too long. She hung up and looked at Thierry and said, without particular inflection, Camille wants me to stay with her in Lyon while you're in Geneva. I think I'll go. Camille, her closest friend. A woman who had been telling Maëlle to leave Thierry for 8 months. A woman who thought the divorce papers were already signed. Something cold moved through him. For the week, he said. Yes. She took her coffee to the window. He looked at her profile. The composed, unreadable profile of a woman who was very carefully not showing him her interior, and felt, for the first time with absolute clarity, that he might genuinely, irreversibly, be losing her. Not to the 30 days. Not to the papers on the table. To the simpler, more devastating possibility that she had already quietly, while he was performing gestures and making breakfast, made a different peace with the future. He called Geneva and pushed the meeting. She raised an eyebrow when he told her. Said nothing. He called it again the next day and pushed it further. On the 3rd day, she said, you can't keep deferring it. I know, he said. Then why are you? He looked at her from across the kitchen. Because I'm terrified that if I leave this apartment, I'll come back and you'll be gone. The silence was long. You should have been terrified of that 18 months ago, she said, and she left the room. He stood alone in the kitchen and understood, in a way he hadn't fully until this moment, that the 30 days were almost over. That flowers and breakfast and dances in the living room, however real his feeling behind them, had not automatically repaired the architecture of a marriage damaged at its foundations. That Maëlle was a woman who required more than gestures. She required proof, not of effort, of change. He didn't know if he'd given her that. He didn't know if she'd decided. That uncertainty was the most frightening thing he had ever lived inside. She went to Lyon for 4 days. He stayed in the penthouse alone and discovered, with unpleasant clarity, what the apartment felt like without her. Felt like the Marie Celeste, set for a life that had simply ceased. He moved through the rooms and all of it was wrong. The coffee he made was wrong. The silence was wrong. The bed was, he didn't sleep in the bed. He slept on the sofa in his clothes and woke at 6 with an ache in his neck and lay there in the gray morning light and thought about a white room in a Paris hospital and a name he had only just been trusted with. Elise. He thought about her every morning now. He had begun to, in a way he hadn't permitted himself before. Letting her be real, letting himself grieve properly, not around the edges in the middle of the night but fully, in the daylight, like a father. He was a father. He understood that now. He was a father who had not been present, and that was not forgivable with flowers, and he needed Maëlle to know that he understood the difference. He called her on the 3rd night. She answered on the 4th ring. Thierry. Not unwelcoming. Not warm. Somewhere in between. I'm not calling to ask you to come back, he said. I wanted to say something and I thought I'd waited long enough to say it over the phone rather than waiting for the right moment in person. Because I'm not sure right moments are something I'm owed anymore. A pause. Go ahead. I think about Elise every day. His voice was steady. He'd worked on that. I want you to know that. I want you to know that she is not something that only happened to you. She happened to me too, and I was not there for that, and there is no adequate accounting for it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to know that I carry her, that she is real to me, that I say her name. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then a sound. Small. Just once. The sound of a woman pressing her hand over her mouth. Okay, Maëlle said, very quietly. Okay, he said. She came home the next morning. The 30th day arrived like all last days do, without ceremony, without announcement, the calendar indifferent to its own significance. Maëlle woke before light. She lay still in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of him beside her. That specific warmth she had memorized, forgotten, and memorized again. And she thought with the precision of a woman who has thought about something very carefully for 30 days. What is true? What was true was that she loved him. That had never been in question. Love had not been the problem. The problem was whether love, stripped of trust and presence and shared grief, was sufficient. What was true was that something had shifted in the nursery. That the man she'd watched fall apart on the floor, shaking raw, finally allowing her to see the full extent of what he'd been carrying, was the man she had married. Not the closed, absent, managing version. Him. What was true was that she was still afraid. What was true was that fear and love had always existed in her simultaneously, and the question had never been whether to be afraid. The question had always been what to choose inside the fear. She rose before he woke. She dressed in the charcoal coat he loved. She moved through the apartment with deliberate care. She stood at the marble table for a long time, looking at the papers. Then she picked up her wedding ring from where it had sat, a reproach and a question for 30 days, and she held it in her palm. She thought about Elise. She thought about a man on the phone at 9 in the evening saying I say her name. She set the ring down beside the papers. She picked up her bag. She left. Thierry found the ring at 8:20. He had reached for her side of the bed and found it empty, which was not unusual. But then he had walked into the kitchen and found it empty, and the living room, and had stood in the silence of an apartment that already felt like the Marie Celeste again, and that was when he saw the ring on the table. Beside the papers. The pen laid next to both. He stood very still. Then something moved through him. Not panic, not despair, something older and more essential than either. Something that had been dormant for a very long time and recognized, in this moment, exactly what it was prepared to do. He grabbed his coat. He knew the cafe. Of course he knew it. He had carried a ring in his coat pocket for 11 days before proposing there. Losing his nerve each time she turned to look at the river until finally one gray October afternoon, he'd simply decided that he would rather humiliate himself in front of her than spend one more day without her knowing. He had always known where she went when she needed to think. He had simply, for too long, not gone there. The passage was narrow and damp from 3 days of rain, and the cafe was amber in the morning light the way amber always is in Paris. Like the city is its own warm room. He pushed the door open and the bell rang and she was there. The table by the window, both hands around her coffee cup, looking out at the street with the expression of a woman who is waiting for a verdict she already knows but has not yet received officially. She heard the bell. She turned. He sat across from her without being invited. The waiter appeared. Thierry looked at him. The waiter disappeared. Maëlle watched him with careful eyes. I found the ring, he said. I know you did. That's why you're here. Maëlle. He leaned forward. Close. The full proximity of a man who is done with carefully maintained distances. I am not going to sit across from you and list everything I've done in the last 30 days, because you were there, and you can weigh it better than I can, and I have enough respect for your intelligence not to perform a summary. He held her eyes. What I am going to tell you is this. She said nothing. Her hands were still. I was 29 years old when I sat at this table and asked you to spend your life with me. And the truest thing I knew about myself was that I was terrified of exactly this, of needing someone so completely that their absence would unmake me. And I spent 6 years trying to manage that fear by making myself essential. Indispensable. Always somewhere, always solving something, always needed elsewhere. Because a man who is needed everywhere cannot be destroyed by the loss of one thing. His voice dropped. That was the lie I told myself. And it cost us Elise. It cost you 18 months of grief you carried alone. And I will spend the rest of my life understanding that I cannot fix that. I can only be here now, present now, accountable now. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. Open, not gripping. The way he'd learned, finally, at considerable cost, was the only way to hold something precious. You deserve someone who comes home. I am asking you to let me be that person. Not because I've earned it, because I understand now what I nearly lost. And I will not make peace with losing it. The cafe was quiet around them. Paris outside, getting on with itself, golden and indifferent. Maëlle looked at his hand on hers. She looked at his face. The face she'd been furious at, devastated by, desperately in love with for 8 years. The face she'd tried for 30 days to talk herself out of and had failed every single morning. If you disappear again, she said. If I am alone again in the way I was alone, you won't be. You can't promise. I can promise that you will never be alone in our grief again. His hand tightened over hers. Whatever comes. Elise taught me what I cannot let happen twice. His voice broke on her name. He let it. I say her name every day, Maëlle. Every day. And every day I say it, I know what I almost chose over being present for it. I will not make that choice again. Maëlle's eyes filled. She had been holding this specific thing for 30 days. The question of whether he understood, really understood, what the loss of him during the worst of it had done. And she heard it now, in his voice, in the break of it, in the way he said their daughter's name like something sacred and something terrible simultaneously. And she understood that he did. She turned her hand over. Her fingers laced through his. He exhaled. Long. The sound of something set down after being carried too far. She leaned forward. The kiss began as the quietest possible thing. Barely a press, barely contact, more the acknowledgement of proximity than the fact of it. And then it deepened slowly, the way the light in Paris deepens in late afternoon, not suddenly but irresistibly, until it's everywhere and you can't remember when it changed. His hand came up to her face and she leaned into it and she kissed him with 30 days of restraint and 18 months of grief and 6 years of love and the specific, complicated, unfinished, ongoing truth of all of it. When they pulled apart, she kept her forehead against his. Elise would have had your stubbornness, he said, so quietly. She laughed. The broken, wet, real laugh of a woman who has held something for a very long time and finally set it down in safe hands. And your terrible timing, she said. He kissed her again. Soft. Once. Like a promise made in a language older than words. Outside, Paris continued. The rain had finally stopped. Pale February light fell through the passage and caught the wet cobblestones and turned everything briefly gold. The way Paris does without trying, without apology. Simply by being itself at the right moment. Come home, he said. She stood. She held out her hand. He took it. They walked back together through streets that held all of it. The proposal and the wedding and the nursery they'd painted 40 shades of white and the dinners and the silences and Elise and the 30 days and the ring on the table and the cafe and all of it. Every piece of it, carried between them now instead of separately. Not healed. Not finished. Not perfect. Just together, which had always been the only part that mattered. This is what love actually looks like. Not the falling, but the choosing to return. Again and again, to the person you've hurt and been hurt by and cannot stop choosing anyway. If the story moved something in you, if you felt Elise, if you felt that nursery floor, if you held your breath in that cafe, then you already know this channel is worth staying for. Please subscribe right now. Leave a comment telling me which moment broke you open. Share this with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real. Because they are. They are walking through Paris right now, in the pale winter light, choosing each other. And that is everything.